Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf kafeh. We're going to get started from the end of yesterday's daf. So we had this question. We asked the question. We had this machloka between the rabbis and Rabbi Shimon about the word kihuna. If it says kohen in the pasuk, according to the rabbis, that means it has to be done with yad yamin, with the right hand. And according to Rabbi Shimon, no, that doesn't mean it. If it says etzba, then yes, and etzba and kihuna. But if it just says kohen, no. So then we asked this question, according to what Rabba bar Hanna said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Every time it says either etzba or kuna, according to the rabbis, that means yad yamin. That was the one who explained that. So what do we have this yad for kemitza, right? The pasuk says that you have to put, this is the oil that they put on the leper, on his yado yamani, on his bo and yado, on his bo and regla yamani, and on his ozen, shnuch ozen hayamani. Why did it say in the pasuk yamani, yamani, yamani by each one? So they said each one teaches us a different halacha. We said the yad teaches about kemitza, has to be done with the right hand. The regal teaches about chalitza, has to be done with the right foot. And ozen teaches you about the piercing of the ear of the Eved Ivri, the Jewish slave that wants to stay longer, is on the right. Okay, that's what it taught us. So the question was about the kemitza. According to the rabbis, according to Rabba bar Hanna's interpretation, the name of Rabbi Yochanan, that just by saying kohen it requires right, then the kohen does the kemitza. Again, that's the taking out the dough. Remember, you put it in a vessel, a sanctified vessel, all the dough. This is solet and fine flour, water, usually some oil. Then the kohen dips his fingers in, basically takes out a kometz. From there, he's going to put it into a sanctified vessel. And from there, he's going to carry it, or someone's going to carry it to the altar and burn it on the altar, which is the way you sacrifice a mincha. So it's obvious you need kemitza because the kohen does it. So what do you need this yad, the kemitza, to which we explain? There's two parts of the process that need yamin. One is the kometz, taking the kemitza out, taking it out of the dough, and one is putting it in the sanctified vessel after. That also has to be done with yamin, and that's what we learned from this other pasuk. Okay, that's what we squared away yesterday. Now we get to Rabbi Shimon. Now we're going to have two approaches to what Rabbi Shimon holds about putting this in the sanctified vessel. But either which way is not going to need to be done with the right hand. And then we're going to say, so according to Rabbi Shimon, what's this yad coming to teach us for kemitza? How does he relate to this drasha? Has Rava fit in with Rabbi Shimon? So that's how we start at the beginning of our daf. Rabbi Shimon, dilo by kiddush kometz. He says you don't even need to put it in that sanctified vessel. You can just the kohen can take the kemitza that he took in his hand and bring it straight to the altar. Why doesn't he need it? Well, first of all, it was already in a sanctified vessel. So you don't, remember, the whole dough is in a sanctified vessel. So he doesn't need you to put the kemitza in its own sanctified vessel. So obviously then you can't say it's coming to teach about that. Now there's a debate about whether he really requires this or not. Some people think he does require it to go in this extra vessel. But he thinks it's fine if you put it in the left, with the left hand. In other words, so either he doesn't require it to go in this vessel at all, or even if he does, he's fine with it to be with your left hand. Once again, this is all just the placing in the vessel has to be with your right hand, maybe the holding of the vessel has to be with your right hand. Either which way, he doesn't require right hand. So yad de Rava lamali. So what does he do with that? Now, if you're going to say maybe he requires it for kemitza, and we're actually going to see he does require kemitza to be with your right hand, and he can't learn that from the fact that it says kohen in the pasuk, because we know he doesn't hold that kohen is enough to say, and it doesn't say etzba there, so maybe that, but that's actually learned from some other place, so that he doesn't use yad for kemitza for that, because Mida Rabbi Yehuda bereid Rabbi Chia nafka, he can learn it from where Rabbi Yehuda, son of Rabbi Chia, learns it. The Amar Rabbi Yehuda bereid Rabbi Chia, my time at Rabbi Shimon, as they explain. Okay, this Rabbi Yehuda, in the name of Rabbi Chia, explains Rabbi Shimon's position, why he requires the kemitza be done with your right hand, which means we're going to have a drasha for that, which means we're not going to learn it to our topic, right? And then we're stuck with what's yad l'kemitza coming for, according to Rabbi Shimon. So my time at Rabbi Shimon, da'amar kodesh kodashim kachatat v'kasham. When it talks about the mincha offering, it says it's kodesh kodashim. We actually saw this pasuk already and saw this drasha, like the chatat and like the asham. Okay? Now, what does it mean it's like the chatat and like the asham? Well, we need to say it's like the chatat. If the asham's like the chatat, you don't need both. So what do we learn here? Well, sometimes it's like a chatat, sometimes it's like an asham. How so? Ba'lo ovda b'yad, ovda b'yamin kechatat, ba'lo ovda b'kli, ovda b'smol ke'asham. So now we're going to say, if you want to do it, we learned this already, if you want to do it with your hand, then you have to do it with right. If you want to do it with a vessel, you could do it with the left. So now you see, he basically gets yamin from somewhere else. So what is this yad l'kemitza for? Lo nitzracha ela lekometz minchat chote. He needs it for the minchat chote kemitza. Why? Now, what's the minchat chote? Remember the korban levirate, the sliding scale offering we learned a lot about in the last few masechtot? That depending on how wealthy you are. If you're wealthy, you bring right for certain particular avirot. If you're very wealthy, you bring animals. Less wealthy, birds. Really poor, you bring a meal offering. This is called the minchat chote. Now, the minchat chote, you might have thought, okay, now what we're going to say is, all the menachot need right. If you're going to do it with your hand, right, it needs right. But you need yad to say even the minchat chote. Now, why would that be any different? Well, sal kadat tachamini, you might have thought it would be different, and that's what we need this drasha to tell you. It's no different. But you might have thought, ho'il v'amar Rabbi Shimon, shelo yehe korbano mehudal. It's a very fascinating thing with the minchat chote. In minchat chote, most menachot, or many menachot, come with shemen, oil. They're not just flour and water. There's oil in them, and there's frankincense often burnt with them. Besides that, you burn this kometz on the altar, you take a kometz, also of frankincense, and you burn it on the altar. Now, the minchat chote has neither. No shemen, no levona. Now, Rabbi Shimon points out, wait, that means, he says, there's a problem there. Because the sinner is actually winning out. And there's this concept, lo yehe chote niskal. Okay, you can look at Rashi, he quotes this. You wouldn't want, and we'll get to this in Menachot, you wouldn't want the sinner to be rewarded. In the end, the sinner's rewarded because a regular mincha offering, you have to bring oil with it, you have to bring levona, that costs money. Right? We buy oil in the store, right? It costs money, and the frankincense costs money. So all those are extras that cost money to the person who has to bring the mincha offering. Now you have a sinner who has to bring a mincha offering who ends up getting rewarded because they don't need to pay extra money for the shemen and the levona. They bring basically solet, fine flour, and water. So they get away with, it's like getting away with murder, right? They end up, right, that phrase, right, they're basically exactly the same thing, but they're getting rewarded for their bad deed. So that doesn't seem right. So he says there, so because of that, so then he said, so why doesn't, and what they're basically saying is, why did the Torah require the frankincense and the oil? And the answer given is, Shelo yehe korbano mehudar. And who gives that answer? Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon says we don't want them to have a nice, beautiful korban. We want our korban to be as simple and basic as possible because it's a mincha of a sinner. So we keep it as basic as possible. So even though we have two conflicting interests here, but we side on lo yehe korbano mehudar. So what does that have to do with us? Well, you might have thought, since Rabbi Shimon says, Shelo yehe korbano mehudar, and that's why it doesn't have the oil and the frankincense, ki kametz lebismol nami titkasher. What's the idea of doing it yamin? Yamin is respectful, right? It's like doing it with the right hand. That's the better way to do things. Okay, again, without getting negative on lefties, myself being a lefty, right? But there's always this idea of yamin of God, and like I said, you can listen to Alana Steinhin's shir this week, where really she talks about this idea about why the right is so significant. It's like the right of God, like the right hand of God. Anyway, that's the issue of the right. So you might have thought that maybe if you do it with the left, which doesn't look as nice, maybe it doesn't matter. Because anyway, we don't want it to be a very nice looking korban. Kamash malan. That's what we need the drasha for, of the yad the kemitza, to say also it has to be done with the right hand. Okay, and don't say what you might have thought because it doesn't have oil, doesn't have frankincense, maybe doesn't need to be done in the right. No, it does. Okay, so now we resolve that, finish the sugya. We're moving on to a new Mishnah. Nishbach adam al haritzpa v'asafo pasul. Okay, so if we have this blood falls on the floor from the animal, okay, we're going to get all into, okay, we saw this before, this sugya was mentioned. Remember, there's two Mishnayot. There's one in the third chapter, right, we're in the second still. There's one in the third chapter which says if the blood if the blood goes into the vessel, which is what's supposed to happen, Kabbalat Hadam, that we've been talking about a lot. We're really going to get into the gory details of Kabbalat Hadam today. If it goes into the vessel and then falls on the floor, you can collect the blood and still use it. But if it fell straight from the animal onto the floor, it's no good. So we're going to talk about why that is. Tanu Rabbanan. So we're going to bring a braita that has a source for this halacha and another halacha about kabbalat hadam. V'lakach kohen Mashiach midam apar. Now we're quoting the chatat of the kohen Mashiach. If we go back to Horayot, right, we learned a lot about this. So, but now we're not focusing on the elements we focused on last time. Now we're focusing on the korban elements. So you take, the kohen takes, okay, lakach kohen Mashiach midam hapar. He takes from the blood of the bull. So now, what's midam hapal? From the blood of the bull means midam nefesh, the blood of the soul of the animal. This means when you slaughter the animal, out spurts a lot of blood that takes the life of the animal. That's the blood that we want. Okay, what's the blood we don't want? Lo midam haor. Not if you, now when you slaughter the animal, first you cut the neck. So when you cut any piece of skin, blood comes out. We don't want that kind of blood, not the blood of a cut. Okay? V'lo midam hatamtzit. And not the blood that comes after all the blood that spurts out, that takes the life of the animal. After that, there's a little more blood left. We don't want that either. We want the basic big spurt of blood that comes out when you kill the animal. Okay. Next drasha, and this is the one that's important for our purposes, and this is why we brought the braita. Midam hapal, dam mehapar yikablenu. You have to get the blood straight from the bull, okay, or whatever animal it is. So that means if it falls on the floor first and didn't go into the vessel and first went somewhere else, like on the floor, it's disqualified. It has to be that the blood comes straight from the bull into the vessel. We're going to talk about this a lot today. Now, midam apar, how do we get from the words from the blood of the bull? Now, usually when we have midam, it means some of, not all of it, right? So they're going to say, okay, that's the end of the braita. Now we're going to explain it. How do we get from midam apar to dam mehapal? Right? They actually know, if you notice, dam mehapar and midam apar, what they did is they take the mem from the beginning of midam and they move it to the second word. They say dam mehapal instead of midam hapal. Those are two different things. Dam mehapar means blood from the bull. Midam hapar means from the blood of the bull. Dam mehapar means blood straight from the bull. Okay? So those are two different things. So isa kadatach midam hapar kedichtiv. If you think we read this simply from the blood of the bull, midam va'afilu miksatam, then you would get to a different conclusion. You would say midam, every time we've learned this many times, the letter mem in the beginning of a word means from, which means from the blood, meaning you don't actually have to collect all the blood. That would be the simple reading of this pasuk. Now we're going to see that according to Rav, this is simply not true. And that's why we can't darshan it the simple way of reading it, and that's why we darshan it differently. Because Rav said, Hashochet, okay, here's the third halacha we're learning. The first was which blood? The dam nefesh, the life blood. Secondly, the blood has to go straight from the animal into the vessel. Third, okay, those were both learned from this braita. Third, Rav teaches us, Hashochet tzarich shikabel et kol damo shapal. The shochet has to collect all the lifeblood of the animal. Okay? All of it has to be collected. Shene'emal ve'et kol damo yishpoch. Okay, this is going to be a bit of a strange drasha. We're going to see in a minute how he really gets this. But we're actually in a pasuk now that talks about later on in that, like pasuk Zayin, two pasukim later. So the pasuk we were just at, he takes the blood from the bull. Then it says, and then he puts the blood on the corners of the altar, and et kol dam apar, and then all the blood of the animal, yishpoch el yesod mizbach haolad. This is what we call the shirayim. Whatever's left over gets poured in the base of the altar. Okay, if you haven't figured out what's problematic about that pasuk, we'll see it in a minute together. But if you think already, wait, something makes no sense, we'll get to it right away. So hold off right now. But his main point is, it says all the blood of the par in that pasuk gets spilled on the base of the altar. So there you learn that all the blood needs to be collected. Okay? Shneimar et kol damo yishpoch. Okay? Now, so therefore, it can't be midam hapal, meaning from the blood of the bull, meaning only collect some of it, because it said all of it has to be collected. So therefore, elami dam hapar is dam mehapar yikablenu. Now, I mentioned before that they took the mem from one word and they put it on the next word. And now they're going to say, yeah, this is a style of drasha. Kasavar, the fact that this Braita did this kind of drasha is because this Braita holds that gorim umosifim v'dorshim. You can take one letter away from one word, attach it to another word, and then darshan it, which is what exactly they did. They took the mem, they said it can't be midam, because it can't be some of the blood. You have to take all the blood, and that we prove from the Shirayim pasuk. So take that word, letter, stick it on the next word, and darshan it. And that's what we got. The dam has to come straight from the bull. Gufa. Now we'll get back to this drasha of Rav. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Okay, now we see the Rav Yehuda quoted in the name of Rav. Hashochet tzarich sheyikabel et kol damo shel pal, shene'amar ve'et kol dam hapar yishpoch. To which the Gemara asks, v'ha b'shirayim ktiv. But that pasuk isn't talking about kabbalat adam. There's two issues really with this pasuk. One, to use this pasuk as a drasha. Well, there's two issues. I should say in general, there's two issues. One is, how do we use this pasuk for this drasha? That pasuk was talking about whatever's left after you sprinkle the blood on the altar or place the blood on the altar. In that case, it was placing. After you place the blood on the altar, you take the remainders and you dump them on the base of the altar. It's not talking about kabbalat hadam, number one. That's the first problem. Well, the second problem is going to be the answer to the first problem, which is, well, ime no inyan l'shirayim. You can't possibly say that all the blood is referring to the remainder. Why? Well, let's just put it this way. If it says all the blood you should spill on the base of the altar, but all the blood is the remainder, well, by default, or by definition, I should say, remainder means not all of it, because some of it was already put on the altar. So the fact that this pasuk, when it's talking about the remainder, says all the blood. Now, obviously, you could say, okay, all the blood means all the blood that's left. That's the simple reading of the verse. But what they're trying to say is that pasuk means all the blood needs to be collected, right? Now, we can't be talking about the remainder and say all the blood, because all the blood is not the remainder. You used some of the blood already. You don't have all the blood of the animal at this point. So since it can't be talking about, okay, that's what the Gemara says here. Im eno inyan l'shirayim, this can't be talking about a shirayim, the remainder really, because dahalete l'kulei dam. Meaning the drasha about all the blood can't be referring to the remainder, because there is no all the blood anymore. You use some of it. Lete l'kulei dam means you don't have all the blood at this point. And therefore, tenei u'nyang b'kabbalah. So this is a classic. If it can't be talking about this, it must be talking about something else. What are they worried about? The word kol. Why say all here? All must mean all the blood, but it can't be referring to the remainder because we don't have all the blood. So it must mean when you collect the blood originally, make sure you have all the blood. And that's how they get to the drasha. Okay, so what was strange about that pasuk, there were two issues here. One is the pasuk itself. How can you say all the blood? There isn't all the blood left. And secondly, how do we use a pasuk about the remainder to talk about Kabbalah? Well, that goes hand in hand. Since that can't be talking about the remainder, it must be talking about the accepting of the blood or collecting of the blood. So from there, we got to our drasha, which, in other words, again, just to see where we are structure, in terms of the structure of the Gemara, that was also explained Rav. It said you have to collect all the blood, which explained, right, that was the whole thing about how you can't read mi dam hapar as some of the blood of the par, because it's not some of the blood. You have to collect all the blood. So therefore, we move the mem to the next word, and Darshan did that. The blood has to come straight from the par. And that's the main halacha here that we're looking at, which is the blood has to come straight from the bull, and we're going to go into this more, straight from the bull into this vessel that you're collecting the blood in. Can't pass anywhere on the way, can't go straight to the floor, it's disqualified. Okay, if it goes somewhere else, it's no good. And we're going to add to this now. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, he now quotes Shmuel as saying, as soon as you slaughter, take the knife, slaughter the animal, pick up the knife. Why? Has to be from the blood of the bull, but not from something else. So we don't want the blood that's dripping off the knife. Okay? I told you we're going to get a little gory detail here today. We want the knife not to be dripping the blood from the knife into there. Again, this all goes back to it has to come straight from the bowl into the vessel, not through the knife. Now they just ask this other question, which is a few different interpretations why they're actually asking this question, what the question is all about. But I'll go with one interpretation. Vidam sakin, the blood on the knife, b'mayim kanechle. Now the assumption, okay, we'll go with this version of the question. The assumption is that the blood on the knife has sanctity to it, because it was used to sacrifice this animal. So while we can't use it and collect it in the vessel, how do we treat it, right? You have to treat sanctified items with sanctity. So what are we doing with this blood? We can't just wipe it off and throw it in the garbage or something like on a paper towel. So what do we do with it? Amar Abaye b'sfat mizrach. You use the outside of the bowl, of the vessel, to wipe it down. How do we know that you can use the outside of the vessel for this kind of thing? Well, k'dichtiv, it's a bit of a strange reference to this. Kforei zahav. Kforei zahav, now, we say is, well, that's what they call these vessels. They're called kforei zahav in the pasuk. The root is kaf peresh, like kapara. Now, what does atonement do? It cleanses you. So they say kafol is also to cleanse. So what this means is these are cleansing utensils. You can use them to clean the knife off. Okay, and that's their drasha here to connect it. Okay, that was a bit of a side point about the knife. Now we get to Amar of Chista, Amar of Yirmiyah bar Abba. We're going to start this other section now, which relates to what we're talking about, but we're going to get a little bit off into para aduma stuff and other things. So first, Rav Chista said the name of Yirmiyah bar Abba, ha-shochet. Tzarich sheyitin, turning now to Amud Bet, vridin letoch hakli. You have to put the veins that are right next to the esophagus and the trachea, which you're slaughtering. The blood from there also has to go into the vessel. You put the veins in the vessel. Now Rashi says, okay, you don't put the veins of the animal in the vessel. That's impossible. Okay, it's not a realistic thing. What he says is, and this is what we're going to get into our next sugya, you put it right over. Okay, meaning you bring the neck of the animal, you bring the bowl or the vessel right underneath the animal. So you basically have animal, airspace. We're going to have a big sugya about airspace, and vessel. Okay? So you make sure that the neck of the animal is right above the vessel. And not only did they quote this in the name of Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, but Itmar Nami was also said, Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Asi quotes Rabbi Yochanan as saying, Vridim tzarich shiru avir kli. Okay, he says it specifically about the airspace, that the veins need to see, okay, obviously they don't see their veins, they just mean the veins need to be right above the airspace of the vessel. So that why? Because we want it to go straight into the vessel. Okay, now, we're going to see maybe even more than that. So, Ba'amine Rabbi Asi and Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Asi asked Rabbi Yochanan a question. We're going to have 3 versions of this question and the answer. Okay? Haya mekabel. So here's the first version. Haya mekabel. V'niftechu shulei mizrak ad shelo higia dam la'avil mahu. Now, what did we say before? The blood has to get into the vessel. And if it spills on the ground after that, you can actually recollect it and put it back on the altar, right? And bring it. If it falls directly on the floor, it's disqualified. So now, there's an assumption that if it entered the vessel, or even the airspace of the vessel, it doesn't have to get to the bottom of the vessel. As soon as it's in the airspace of the vessel, that's considered in the vessel. Here comes the question. What if you're collecting the blood? Now in the second, okay, it's like milliseconds even, that the blood is falling into the vessel from the animal, so it goes through the airspace. That's why I said we're going to talk about airspace. So it's now in the airspace, in between the neck of the animal and the vessel. And niftichu shulei mizrak. Mizrak is the bowl that you're collecting it in. And it breaks, okay? Like the bottom of the bowl falls, something happens, and there's no vessel. Okay? Ad shelo higia dam la'avil mahu. If the blood didn't get into the airspace yet of the vessel, how do we view this? Do we say, avil she'ein sofo lanuach kimunach dami, the airspace above the vessel, right? So it's, now, you have to remember, there's the airspace of the kli itself, which is kind of, in the sides of the kli, but didn't yet hit the bottom. But then there's, if you draw a line from the sides of the vessel upward, right, of vertical lines, that's also considered airspace of the vessel. So if it got into that airspace, without actually entering into the sides of the it didn't get into the airspace of the actual kli, but above it, within the lines, drawn from the vessel, now, here's the question. it sounds like they're saying, let's listen to the wording. Avir she'ein sofo lanuach, since it's not going to end up, because we know, because the kli ends up breaking before it gets into the airspace of the kli, because into actually the kli, is that kimunach dami. But because it was about to land in there, even though in the end the kli broke before it was able to, but is that considered, if it enters the airspace above the vessel, is it as if it entered into the vessel, right? Why? Because, gravity is pulling it down, right? So it's as if it landed. Or, lo kemunach dami, or do we say, since it isn't sofo lanuach, since in the end this blood will never make it into the vessel, we don't view it as if it was in the vessel. It makes it sound like if the vessel didn't break, once it enters the airspace above the vessel, it's as if it's actually in the vessel. That's what it sounds like they're saying. But the question is here, since it was about to break, what would be the halacha? So Amrle, Tanitua, he says, I have a bright to prove it. Now for this we have to go into a completely different topic and completely different ramifications, but ramifications of the same issue. How do we view airspace above a vessel? Although we'll see it's not exactly the same issue. The exact same principle. But anyway, right now let's learn it and then we'll see. Para aduma waters. What do you have to do? For the para aduma, you want to purify people or vessels that have become impure to a dead body. So you collect the ashes from a burnt red heifer. And then, you slaughter the red heifer, you burn it, then you take the ashes and you mix it with fresh water. Mayim chayim, it's called. So this has to come from a stream or something like that. So if water is stream, now the issue is like this. It has to come directly from a stream and not that it was put into some other vessel. We're going to learn 2 halachot about it today, so this is the first one. It has to come directly from the stream. So if you have a stream of water, that's our bright here. Chavit shemunachat tachad zinuk. We have a zinuk. A zinuk is a flow, but it's a flow that we've now put a pipe or something like a pipe. I'm trying to think of a better word for it, but we'll go with a pipe. You put a pipe for the water to go through the pipe. And you want the water, why are you putting a pipe there? Because you want to channel it. So you use this to channel the water into a barrel. Now this barrel is not where you're planning to, don't get confused. This is a barrel, you just want to channel this water into a barrel for whatever reason. And then you want to know, can you take the water from that barrel and use it for mechata, put it in a different vessel and mix it? Can't do that. Because once it enters the vessel, this barrel, you can no longer use it. Because remember, it has to go straight from the fresh water flow. It could go through a pipe or a channel, because that's not a vessel. That's open on both sides, right? Nothing can stay in there. So that's not called a vessel. As long as it doesn't follow through a vessel, you're okay. But if it goes into a vessel first, which is this chavit that we're talking about, it's disqualified. Now you can't use that water that went into the vessel for paraduma. That's a fact. But the question is, what if it entered the airspace above the vessel, right? So if you have something coming out of a pipe, so we have the stream of water coming, a pipe that the water's channeled through, and then it kind of, there's like this arc shape where it goes from there into the vessel and it starts falling into the vessel. Before it falls into the vessel, it's in the air above the vessel. So the question is that water considered as if it went into the vessel? So the Braita says, so we have a barrel that's basically under this zinuk, this flow that we've channeled. Mayim shebetocha v'shebechutz ala psulim. Any water that went into the barrel can't be used for mechata because it's no longer coming from a direct stream because it came from this vessel. And bechutz ala, and outside of it. What they mean outside of it, you'll see in a minute. They mean outside of it is something else. But in this part of the sentence, outside of it means right above it in the line of the barrel. So if you draw 2 lines up or a circular line up from like a sphere shape going upward, anything in that airspace is as if it was already in the barrel. So if I catch the water coming out of the pipe that's right above the vessel, it's as if it was in the vessel. I can't use it for, but if I catch it in the vessel, I want to mix the mechatat, I can't. It's disqualified. So that's really the answer to the question. Although you might notice it's not really an answer to the question, but you'll see why in a minute. But we think that answers our question. Anything above the airspace is right in the airspace even though it didn't get into the actual airspace of the vessel, it's right above it. It's already as if it was in the vessel. For our purposes, right, that would tell us if you're collecting it before, right, you collect it before, and it didn't, right, and then it fell, let's say the kli broke and it fell on the floor, it was as if it was already in the vessel. Okay, the problem is, what's the problem? Well, we were talking about a kli that's about to break. This one is talking about a kli that wasn't about to break. So now it doesn't really answer our question. Because remember, we said it was kind of obvious to us, or at least it seemed from the question, that if it enters the airspace of a vessel that's not about to break, then it would be considered as if it was in the vessel. The question was, since the vessel is about to break, how do we view it? That's the problem with this answer. But we'll get there in a minute. Let's just read the end of the Braita, which isn't really as relevant. If you put the barrel right by the pipe, where it's coming out of the pipe and it goes directly without entering into any airspace, any water in the vessel obviously is already disqualified because it was collected in a vessel. Now here chutzala means something else. Shebechutzala psulim means anything that didn't yet get to the vessel, like for example, if it's still in the pipe, and let's say you stopped it from going into the vessel and you took the water that was going through the pipe, well, that's obviously fine because it's still connected to the stream of water and it hasn't gone into a vessel yet. Okay, anyway, the Gemara says, what kind of proof is this? Hi, my. It was asking about something that was never, the airspace above something where it in the end was never going to go into the vessel because the vessel broke. And you answered from this case of the barrel where it was going to go, right? The water was going to go right into the barrel didn't break. So that doesn't answer our question at all. This, by the way, raises the issue that I told you there's 3 versions of what the question was and what the answer is, because there's obviously a problem with this question and answer version because the answer doesn't match the question. To which they answer, Tarte kabaimine. It must have been a 2-pronged question. And this is the way it is. Now, I mentioned that when you ask the question, is it like sofo lanuach or is it not, right? Is it, since when it was coming down, the kli wasn't broken, is it as if it was airspace above a kli that was stable or not? But now they're going to say, actually, don't make that assumption. It was a 2-pronged question, and it started like this. Now, if you're going to say that since this kli was about to break, we don't view the blood that was above the vessel as if it was going to go into the vessel, because the vessel, by the time it got down there, it was broken. It's not as if it was in the ground. But But even if you say that's not, in other words, if you ask question number 1. So if you answer question number 1 and say, listen, since it was about to break, it's not as if it was in the vessel, and therefore, again, if the blood falls, went first into the airspace above the vessel, not within the vessel, but above, fell on the ground then because the vessel broke, without ever going through the walls of the vessel, that's no good. But what would you say if it entered the airspace above the vessel, and then let's say someone swatted their hand, knocked it to the side before it ever entered the vessel? Is that viewed as if it was entered the vessel because it could have entered the vessel and the vessel didn't break? And then the answer given is to the second part of the question. Okay, because the answer is brought from a vessel that is actually on the ground. And then it wasn't obvious. Now the answer is yes. Once it enters that airspace above, it's as if it was in the vessel. But it wasn't as obvious as we thought. It was the second part of the question. Okay, so that was Rav Yosef Manehachi. That was Rav Yosef's version of what question Rabbi Asi asked Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Kahana Mane, but he had a different version. Because again, as I said, there's a problem with this question. So, by the way, just in terms of methodologically, what did we do to resolve the difficulty? Instead of changing the answer, what we did was we changed the question. We said since we have a question and answer that don't match up, either you can change the answer or you can change the question. So we just modified the question to make the answer work. And then it worked only for half. It didn't really answer the original question that we had. The second version has a totally different version. Chavipa amine. So Rav Kahana Mane, Rav Kahana's version of the question was, by the way, I just want to point out, these are Amoraim of Babylonia who were struggling to figure out what was the question that an Eretz Israeli Amora asked a different Eretz Israeli Amora. You could see why there was a problem in the transmission. This was a question asked far away from them, and they were, they had traditions about what it was. So Rav Kahana's version is Chavipa amine upashat lechavi. the whole question, this had absolutely nothing to do with our topic. The whole question was, what's the story with a barrel, with the water coming out, and the water that goes over, is it also disqualified? And the answer is, here's a braita, and it says exactly what the answer is, which is, again, once it enters the airspace, it's as if it was in the kli. And that's totally different and having nothing to do with our topic. The third version is, Rabba mane chavipa mine upashat le mizrak. The reverse of ours. The question was asked about a barrel, and the answer was given from the bowl that catches the blood. How so? Okay, so again, the question is, do we view the airspace above the barrel as if it went into the barrel already, which for paraduma it would disqualify, because once it goes into some other vessel, you can't use it now in your vessel to make the paraduma waters. So how by the slaughtering of an animal? Well, remember our halacha. It has to go directly from the animal into the vessel. Now, it doesn't really go direct because it goes through the airspace first. So, don't you agree with the mizrak that there's no way to do it without it flowing through the air? So if it has to flow through the air first, and we also said it has to go directly into the vessel, well then the air above the vessel must be considered like the vessel, because otherwise there would be some break in between which would disqualify it. Right? Then it wouldn't be able to ever work. You would never be able to catch the blood and fulfill the halacha that it goes straight into the vessel. So therefore, from there you could see that any airspace above a vessel is considered like the vessel itself. Okay, now we're moving on to staying within our topic of para aduma. Okay, we've mentioned para aduma. Now we're going to quote another mishnah from para aduma. Tananatama, or mishnah from para, but about para aduma. Natanya do oraglo, and it's also about water flowing. This is a different halacha though. Well, I already explained it outside. If you have water flowing, let's say on an incline, on a decline, okay, or an incline, so you have water flowing down, and now you want to get the water into the vessel. Now this time you want to get it into the vessel to prepare the para aduma waters, not that the water is going to some other vessel and disqualifies it. Now we're putting it into the vessel. But you can't put the vessel exactly at the bottom of the hill because it's not going to go in properly. So what do? You prop up, like you put something at the bottom so that it goes like upward a little and flows then into your barrel. So you need to basically, it's again, like a water kind of channel. So there's a halacha about what you can use and what you can't use to channel the water, because what did we say? The water has to go directly into the kli from the, okay, so now we're going to learn something. Has to be, this is some other halacha that we didn't see. Has to, so the water flow is going into the kli, that's fine. It's not going into something else in between. But it also has to be channeled, if you're going to channel it with something, has, or I should be very particular how I say this, the last place it has to be before it goes into the vessel has to be something that's not susceptible to impurity. So therefore, Natan yado o raglo o ale yirakot kedei she'avru mayim lachavit. If you use your hand or your leg or leaves of vegetables to basically channel this water, psulim, it's disqualified. Ale kanim v'ale agozim kshera. But if you use leaves from reeds or leaves from walnuts, kshera. Why? Because those aren't edible. And zaklal, whereas ale yirakot are edible. Obviously, hands and feet are not edible, but those are susceptible to impurity, and food is susceptible to impurity. So this is the rule. Davar mekabel tuma psulim, davar she'eno mekabel tuma ksherim. Has to be channeled through something that's not susceptible to impurity. Minani, where do we get it from? Dam Rabbi Yochanan, Mishum Rabbi Yossi bar Abba, Amar Kra, Ach ma'ayan ubor mikveh mayim yihiyeh tahor. A ma'ayan or a bor or mikveh mayim. Now this is really talking about a mikveh, but they use the same about the mechatat. Will be tahor. Now, yihiyeh, they learn yihiyeh from the language of havayatan, their creation also. Havayah is to create something. The creation of the waters has to be al yidei tahara, al yidei tarateh. So that means it has to be created by something pure, meaning when you're putting it into wherever the mikvah or the vessel that you're going to use to prepare the mechatat has to be from a source of something pure. So, and also something that can't be susceptible to impurity, even though your hand might not be impure right now, but it is susceptible to impurity, that disqualifies it. So, Amar Rabbi Chia, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Zot Omeret. Now, what did I tell you? The very last stage before it goes in there is what we're concerned with. Just the last stage. If it went by your hand and then it went somewhere else, like let's say, and then it went through alei agozim and straight into the kli, it would be fine. So what do they say here? Well, think about what happens. If you're channeling it, and their assumption is you're channeling a little bit upward to get into the vessel, then it has to pass through airspace first. Now, airspace is not susceptible to impurity. So if it first hits airspace before it, if it goes from your hand to the airspace to the vessel, well, the airspace should mean the last thing it hit was airspace, which is not susceptible to impurity. It should be fine. But this says it's not fine, even though it goes hand to airspace to vessel. So what does that teach you again? Avir kli kikli dami. That the airspace above the vessel is as if it's the vessel, and that's why we view this as it goes straight from your hand into the vessel, even though it's not really. So that's what Rabbi Chia said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Amar le Rabbi Zera, Rabbi Chia bar Abba, v'dilma b'shotet. Why do you say that? Maybe it didn't go upward and there's airspace it hits first. Maybe it went straight down, straight into the barrel, into the vessel. That could be. To which Amar le, he says back to him, Trad. Okay, when Rabbi Zera said to Rabbi Chia bar Abba this, Rabbi Chia says to him, to Rabbi Zera, Trada, you imbecile. Like, what kind of a statement is that? Of course not. Look at what it says. It says that the water will pass into there. That means you have to kind of pass it upward. Okay, it doesn't mean it drips down. If it dripped down, you wouldn't need to put your hand there to basically push it. And the wording doesn't match at all what you're saying. And again, you can learn from here, the airspace above a vessel is like it was in the vessel already. So that's why we brought this, because it's teaching the same idea. And we'll just finish up this section with Rabbi Chia bar Abba, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Me'edu Tosha Rabbi Tzadok Nishnei Mishnazo. This Mishnah that we just talked about was taught in the name of Rabbi Tzadok. Ditnan, as we see in the Mishnah, He'id Rabbi Tzadok. Okay, this is from Edu Yo. You have all these testimonies of people. Ala zochalim shekacham ba'alei agozim shem kshirim. Okay, if you stream these waters through the alei agozim, it's actually kasher, because remember, that's not susceptible to impurity. There was a case, actually, the Mishnah continues there in Eduyot. There was a case, there was a case there, and they permitted. Okay, so that's the end of the section about the airspace being as if it's in the vessel, and not all we all got to, because of the blood goes through the air till it gets to the kli, and we don't view that as something that it went in between to somewhere else, because again, we learned the dam is to come straight from the par. We learned all the blood is to come. The blood is to come straight from the par, not also from the knife. Okay, we learned a whole bunch of halachot. Now we're going to end with this other halacha. Amar Rabbi Zera, Amar Rabbi, Hatzolem ozen para. Okay, some people say it's Amar Rabbi Yochanan. That must be, it should be Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Hatzolem ozen apal. Let's say you make a nick in the ear of the animal, which blemishes the animal. Then the animal's a balmum. Now, can't you be used as a sacrifice? V'acharkach kibel damo. Now here, what if you did it after it was slaughtered? So the animal was totally fine, not blemished before when you slaughtered it, but after you slaughter it when the animal's already dead or dying, you then blemish the animal. Pasul, this disqualifies the animal. That's very strange, because the animal's dead already. Well, shenemar v'lakach midam hapal. Now, even after the animal's dead, what does it say? You have to take the blood. That's after the slaughtering. And it calls it the blood of the bull. Why is it called the blood of the bull at that point? Why is it so called the bull? Teaches you parshaya kfa. It has to be the bull. The bull has to still be in its state that it was before. Now, obviously, it's dead, but you can't blemish it in any other way. If it is, disqualified. Okay, they say fine. Now, what's that talking about? The chatat of the kohen Mashiach, which is a sin offering. So eshkachan kochim kalim minalim. So we get that this halacha is true by kochim, that if you blemish the animal after the slaughtering, before the blood, anytime before the blood is sprinkled on the altar, the sacrifice is disqualified. But how do we know that it's true for the lower level sanctity offerings? Like, for example, Korban Pesach. So now they're going to try to bring a proof from Korban Pesach, but we're going to see we can't really learn from this in the end. And that's where we'll end today. I'm a Rava Tanya. It says in a Braita, Set tamim zachar ben shana yihiyeh. Okay, this is, I'm just reading one more word, yelachem. Okay, this animal should be to you, the animal you're going to take for the Korban Pesach, which is a kochim kalim, because the people eat the meat. That makes it lower level. It has to be a lamb or a in that family. Tamim, complete, not blemish. Male, ben shana. Okay, 1 year old, within its first year. Shehei tamim uben shana b'shat shchita. So it's obvious, right? It has to be all those things at the time of the slaughtering. Big kabbalah b'holachab is rikaminai. And how do you know that also it needs to be tamim, unblemished? This is what we're looking for when you're doing the later stages. Talmud lomar yihiyeh. Again, we darshan this word yihiyeh differently than we did before. We had it earlier today with some other thing. The way it's created, we just had. But this is yihiyeh. Kol havayotav lo yiyu elatam uben shana. all the processes you're going through with this animal have to be done when the animal is in that original state. Okay? Yet, it has to be that way completely from start to finish. Again, finish is sprinkling of the blood. Abai says, wait, it still has to be tam after? No way. Rabbi Yochanan Omer, kol hazvachim shebatorah, shenishteyer mehem kezayit basaro kezayit chelev, zoreket adam. What if you lose the rest of the animal by the time you go to do the zrika? Okay? And let's say the animal disappears. Okay, I don't know. Somebody took the meat out of the temple. You can't find it. Well, you can't sprinkle the blood unless you have the animal. But now we learn, as long as you have a kezayit of the meat, or kezayit of the fats that burn on the altar, as long as you have a little bit of it, that's fine. Now, what more blemish is that? That all you have is a little piece of the animal. That's completely blemished, right? The animal's gone and non-existent. So, what do they say? And that seems to go against. Can't be that. So, tirguma aben shana. They say, what they mean is if it turned to the second year in between the shchita and the zrika and kabbalah and all that. It's not the issue of the mum, the blemish. That for sure is not a problem because even if you have a kezayit left, that's fine. But it must be the year. Okay, now when do you celebrate your birthday? The beginning of the day, right? Shchita, zrika, kabbalah, all those things happen in the same day. You can't do them tomorrow. It's disqualified. So they ask, how do you turn to the next year, right, 5 minutes later? Or even if you do it 3 hours later, it's still the same day. You don't turn to the second year on that day. To which Rava is an interesting way to end our daf today. Zot omeret sha'ot poslo b'kodashim. With animals and disqualifications of ages, it goes by the hour they were born. I don't know who kept track of all this, but it goes by the hour. So theoretically, if let's say you slaughter it at 12:30 in the afternoon, the Korban Pesach, and then you do it at 1:30, you do the sprinkling of the blood, and let's say at 1 o'clock the animal turned into its second year, it would be disqualified. And that's what it's going to teach you. This doesn't teach you anything about the mum, because the mum isn't true. And then we're left with, it's really only for kodesh kodeshim and not kodeshim kalim, this halacha that we learn. Okay, so we dealt with today. We started with this issue of Rabbi Shimon and how does he do the yad. What does he use that drasha for? We went to the blood spilling straight on the floor. From there we got into all sorts of halachot about kabbalat adam. Number 1, dam nefesh, the lifeblood. Number 2, dam mehapar. It has to be directly from the par, not going through anything else. It has to be all the blood, which we got from the shirayim with an imeno inyan. From there, we got to this thing about the vridim have to be right above the vessel and about the airspace, and that was all because it has to go directly and it can't pass anything else in between. And we had 3 versions of a question that really all led to saying the airspace above a vessel is as if it went into the vessel already, even though it didn't. Although we were still left with this open question, what if the vessel broke before it actually entered in there? And then would we view that as not? And we didn't really end up with a good answer to that question. And then we ended with this issue of a blemish that happens after the slaughtering, before the zrika actually, or before the kabbalah, can disqualify a korban, but we only have proof for it by kodesh kodeshim, and we didn't really have proof for it by kodeshim kalim. And we did end with this idea about how they counted the animal years by the hours and not by the day. Wishing everyone a good day, and may we have good news quickly, and may the hostages return soon. Definitely on a closer path to that, so hoping that this will bring good news for everybody.